That morning started out quiet, the kind of morning where everything feels calm. The sun was soft in the sky and birds could be heard somewhere in the distance. A black car sat parked on the side of a quiet suburban street, engine off, windows slightly rolled down. Inside the car sat a man in his mid-30s wearing a gray suit and a calm expression. He looked like someone waiting for a meeting or maybe a friend. His phone sat on the dashboard, screen glowing with a few unread messages, but he wasn't in any rush. He had been there for only about 15 minutes, reviewing a few notes on a file beside him. He didn't notice the curtain of a nearby house shift slightly, or that a neighbor was watching him through the window. In a neighborhood like that, people noticed everything. A strange car parked too long. It meant something. A few minutes later, a police car turned the corner, moving slowly. The man didn't think much of it at first. He'd been through many neighborhoods before, seen all kinds of looks. He stayed still, eyes straight, hands on his lap. But the police car didn't drive past. It stopped behind him. The engine idled for a few seconds before the doors opened and two uniformed officers stepped out. The man took a small breath and waited. He knew what was coming. He'd experienced moments like this before, though never in this way. One officer approached the driver's side while the other stayed back, one hand near his belt. "Morning," the first officer said, knocking lightly on the window. The man lowered it halfway. "Good morning, officer. What are you doing here?" "Just waiting for someone," he said, keeping his voice even. "Waiting for someone? In this neighborhood?" the officer asked. His tone wasn't curious. It was suspicious. "Yes," the man replied calmly. "Is there a problem?" The officer's eyes scanned him up and down, then glanced inside the car. "You live around here?" "No. So who exactly are you waiting for?" The man hesitated. He didn't want to give away too much. He had learned the importance of keeping his cover quiet. But before he could answer, the second officer walked closer. "Sir, you mind stepping out of the car?" The man frowned slightly. "Is there a reason?" "You're parked in front of private property. We got a call about a suspicious vehicle." He nodded slowly. That didn't surprise him. He had seen a woman peeking through the curtains earlier. He guessed she had made the call. Still, he tried to stay calm. "I can show you my ID," he offered, reaching toward his jacket. Immediately, the officer's tone changed. "Hands where I can see them," he froze. "All right," he said quietly, placing his hands on the steering wheel. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer kept one hand close to his holster. "You said you're waiting for someone. What's the person's name?" "I don't think I need to tell you that," the man said. "I haven't broken any laws." The officers exchanged a look. The first one leaned slightly toward the car. "Look, we can make this easy or we can make it hard. Step out of the vehicle." He sighed softly. He'd dealt with stubborn people before, in interrogation rooms, in tense meetings, even in life-or-death moments. But this situation was different. These men didn't know who he was. They didn't know that behind his calm eyes was someone who had faced armed criminals, sat in FBI briefings, and carried out dangerous operations. He unlocked the door and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. The air felt heavy. The officers stood close, eyes sharp. "Turn around," one of them said. "For what?" "Just turn around." He did. The officer patted him down roughly, checking his pockets. "You got any weapons?" "No. You sure?" "Yes." The other officer circled the car, peering inside through the window. "What's this folder?" he asked, pulling a manila file from the passenger seat. "It's work material," the man replied. "What kind of work?" "I'm in law enforcement." That made the first officer smirk. "Law enforcement? You?" "Yes," the man said quietly. "All right then, let's see a badge." He reached slowly into his jacket, careful with every move. He pulled out his wallet and flipped it open. Inside was his ID, but before he could show it properly, one officer waved it off. "This doesn't look official." "It's a federal ID," he explained. "If you call the number on the back, you can confirm it." But the officer didn't even glance at it. "We'll figure that out. Sit tight." The man stood beside his car while they whispered to each other. Their tone was dismissive, almost mocking. One of them said something under his breath that the man didn't catch fully. Something about how people like him always had excuses. He didn't react, but inside his patience thinned. He knew what was happening. The same assumptions, the same prejudice dressed as procedure. But he wasn't about to lose control, not here. Not like this. After a few minutes, one of the officers began writing something down. The other spoke into his radio, requesting another unit. The man didn't understand why. He had done nothing wrong. "Am I being detained?" he asked. "Not yet," one officer replied. "We're just checking things out. Then can I go?" "Not until we're done." The man looked at the quiet houses nearby. Curtains moved slightly, showing eyes watching the scene. A few people stood on their porches pretending to water plants or check mail. He could almost hear their thoughts. What did he do? Is he dangerous? Why is he here? Minutes felt like hours. The backup car arrived and 2 more officers stepped out. Now there were 4 of them. They started questioning him again, asking where he worked, why he was there, who he was meeting. He kept giving short, calm answers, but they seemed determined not to believe him. When one of the new officers asked to search the car, the man shook his head. "You don't have consent to do that," the officer shrugged. "We can get a warrant. For what reason?" "Suspicious activity." He almost laughed at the word. Suspicious, he thought. All because he was sitting in a car, in a neighborhood that didn't expect to see someone who looked like him. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, trying to stay composed. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. The main officer smirked. "We'll see." As one of them walked around the car again, the man noticed his phone still sitting on the dashboard. A small light blinked, a reminder of a missed call. He knew exactly who it was from, his field supervisor. He was supposed to meet with him soon, only a few streets away. He thought about explaining everything, telling them the truth, that he was part of an undercover task force working on a major case in the same area. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the realization that no matter what he said right now, they wouldn't believe him until they wanted to. Instead, he said nothing. The officers continued their questions, their tone growing sharper. "Where are you from? What's your business here? Why that car?" Every question felt less like procedure and more like accusation. When the man tried to answer calmly, they talked over him. One of them laughed under his breath. The other looked at him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to find guilt in his silence. Then suddenly things shifted again. One officer pointed toward the car. "He's got a folder marked restricted. Let's open it." "That's private property," the man said firmly. The officer ignored him and pulled the folder open. Inside were documents stamped with federal seals and coded names. His stomach sank. They were looking directly at confidential material. "Where did you get these?" One of them demanded. "I told you," he said. "I work for the government." The officer frowned, confused, flipping through the papers. "These look fake." "They're not." But before the man could explain further, the officer's radio crackled with a new message. A voice came through, distorted but clear enough. "Unit 21, be advised. Federal surveillance operation in progress in your area. Do not interfere." The officers froze. The man stood quietly, watching them realize what they had just done. One of them looked at the other, eyebrows raised. The man said nothing, his eyes calm but sharp. Before anyone spoke, another car turned the corner. A black SUV, official plates. It stopped beside them, and a man in a dark jacket stepped out, flashing a badge. The expression on his face said it all. "Is there a problem here?" the newcomer asked, voice steady but cold. The officers looked at each other, then at the man they had detained. Silence filled the air. The man didn't move. He simply adjusted his jacket, brushed off the dust from his sleeve, and said quietly, "You just stopped the wrong person." No one spoke after that. The air was thick with embarrassment and disbelief. The neighbors who had been watching slowly stepped back from their windows. The officers stood frozen, realizing the weight of what had just happened. The man didn't gloat. He didn't yell or threaten. He simply looked each officer in the eye before stepping toward the SUV. The other federal agent opened the door for him without a word. As he got in, he glanced back once. The officers stood there, stunned, faces pale under the bright morning sun. They had no idea yet that their actions, the words they used, the way they handled the stop, had all been recorded. He closed the door, the SUV drove away, and the quiet street slowly returned to normal. But for the officers left behind, nothing about that day would ever feel normal again. The silence after the black SUV left hung heavy in the air. None of the officers spoke for a while. They just stood there staring at each other with uneasy faces. The sound of birds chirping in the distance suddenly felt too loud. Too normal for what had just happened. One officer kicked the gravel lightly, eyes darting toward the ground. They had just detained a federal agent. The officer who had led the stop ran a hand down his face, sighing. "What just happened?" he muttered under his breath. The others didn't answer. They didn't need to. The embarrassment was written all over their faces. One of them looked toward the houses around them. The neighbors who had been watching had already disappeared behind their curtains, but everyone in that street had seen something. Cameras had been out. Phones had been recording. The officers knew it was only a matter of time before someone uploaded that video online. They stood there for another minute, hoping maybe the moment would somehow disappear if they stayed quiet long enough. But it didn't. The radio on one officer's shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 21, report your status." He hesitated before pressing the button. We're clear now," he said awkwardly. "Did you make contact with the suspicious individual?" There was another pause. Then he replied, "Yes, but it turns out there was a misunderstanding." The voice on the radio came back sharply. "What kind of misunderstanding?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "The individual was an undercover federal agent." The silence that followed on the radio said more than any words could. Then a calm but serious voice came through. "Return to station, now." The officers exchanged a look. No one wanted to be the first to move, but they knew they had no choice. They got back into their patrol cars and drove off quietly, each one lost in thought. Inside the car, the lead officer stared straight ahead. His partner glanced at him nervously. "Do you think we're in trouble?" He didn't answer right away. He just let out a long breath. "Yeah," he said finally. "Big trouble." Back at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Word had already reached the captain before they arrived. The moment they stepped inside, they could feel eyes following them. "Office," the captain said sharply from his doorway. His tone left no room for hesitation. The two officers walked in and stood at attention. The captain, a gray-haired man with a calm but firm presence, sat behind his desk with a tablet in his hand. "Sit down," he said. They sat. The captain swiped across his screen, then looked up. "You want to tell me what happened this morning?" The lead officer cleared his throat. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle in a residential area. We responded. The man said he was waiting for someone. We tried to confirm his identity. And?" He hesitated. "Things got a little tense." The captain leaned forward. "Tense how?" The second officer spoke quietly. "He said he worked for law enforcement. We thought he was lying. We didn't realize that he was with the FBI." The captain finished for him. Both officers nodded. The captain put down the tablet. His expression softened slightly, but his voice stayed firm. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess this is?" Neither officer spoke. The captain continued. "You detained a federal agent, searched his car without consent, and ignored his ID. And from what I've been told, there's body cam footage showing some unprofessional comments. Is that true?" The room went silent. The lead officer's jaw tightened. "We didn't mean any disrespect," he said quietly. "Intent doesn't matter," the captain replied. "What matters is what the cameras saw and what the microphones picked up." He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Internal Affairs will want statements. The Bureau will want a report. And if that footage goes public, this department's reputation will take a hit we can't afford." The officers sat there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on them. The captain's tone softened slightly. "Look, I know tensions happen on the job, but you need to understand something. Bias, assumptions, whatever you want to call it. It has no place in this uniform. That man you stopped today has probably risked his life for this country more times than any of us can count. And you treated him like a suspect because of what? The car he drove? The color of his skin?" Neither of them could answer. The captain pointed toward the door. "Go home. You're both on administrative leave until this is sorted out." They nodded slowly and walked out, heads down. That evening, the story started spreading. A short clip appeared online. Shaky phone footage showing two officers detaining a man in a suit while neighbors whispered in the background. The caption read, "Police stop innocent man. Turns out he's an FBI agent." Within hours, the video had thousands of views. Comments poured in. People arguing, debating, and criticizing. Some defended the officers. saying they were just doing their jobs. Others pointed out the obvious. The man was calm, respectful, and yet treated like a criminal. The internet did what it always did, turned the incident into a storm. By the next morning, local news stations were outside the police department. Reporters asked questions the officers couldn't answer. Were the officers disciplined? Was the stop racially motivated? Has the FBI responded? Inside the station, the captain's phone rang nonstop. Meanwhile, the man they had stopped the day before sat quietly in a conference room miles away, wearing the same calm expression he'd had during the stop. His supervisor sat across from him. You okay? The supervisor asked. He nodded. I'm fine. They told me what happened. You handled it well. He gave a small shrug. It's not the first time something like that's happened. But it's the first time it's been this public. The supervisor leaned back. We've already spoken with their department. The chief apologized. They're launching an internal review. You won't need to appear in any disciplinary hearing unless you want to. I don't want revenge, the man said quietly. I just want it to mean something. Maybe this time people will see how quick judgment can ruin everything. His supervisor nodded thoughtfully. It already means something. Everyone's watching. Back at the local police department, the mood had changed completely. Officers who had once laughed and joked in the halls now spoke in hushed tones. The two officers involved kept to themselves, waiting for updates on the investigation. They knew what was coming. Body cam footage didn't lie. Every word, every tone, every expression, all recorded. When the review board called them in, the room was quiet. 3 senior officers and a representative from Internal Affairs sat at a long table. A screen showed still images from the footage. The car, the suspect, the officers standing too close, their expressions tense. The Internal Affairs officer pressed play. The sound of their voices filled the room. Hands where I can see them. Step out of the car. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Then came the line they had both dreaded. The one spoken too casually, too carelessly, without thinking. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't a slur. But it carried a sting of bias. The kind of remark that revealed what lay beneath the surface. When the clip ended, no one spoke for a few seconds. Then the Internal Affairs officer said quietly, You understand how this looks, right? Yes, the lead officer replied, barely above a whisper. Do you have anything to say for yourself? He thought for a long moment before answering. We thought we were protecting the neighborhood, but I guess we weren't thinking about how it looked from his side. We just saw what we expected to see. The officer beside him nodded slightly, eyes downcast. The board members exchanged looks. Then one of them said, That man was doing his job. You were doing yours. But the difference is he stayed calm even when you didn't. That says something. The meeting ended with suspension notices and a mandatory training order. The officers left the room quietly. Outside, the sun was setting. The streetlights flickered on one by one. The man they had stopped drove past that same street again, this time on official business. The neighborhood looked peaceful. The same trimmed lawns, the same tidy houses. But for him, it carried a different weight now. He thought about how quickly things had escalated, how little control he'd had over how others saw him. But he also thought about how he chose to respond. Calm, measured, dignified. That was what made the difference. He didn't hate those officers. He pitied them a little. Because they hadn't just embarrassed themselves. They had missed an opportunity to see beyond their assumptions. As he turned the corner, his phone buzzed with a new message from his supervisor. FBI PR team releasing official statement tomorrow. We'll emphasize professionalism, both sides cooperating. He read it, nodded to himself, and placed the phone aside. He wasn't looking for credit or sympathy. All he wanted was for the truth to speak louder than anger. That night, the clip from the body cam footage surfaced online. It showed the moment he calmly said, You just stopped the wrong person. The internet reacted instantly. Some called him a hero for keeping his cool. Others said no one should have to prove their worth to be treated with respect. The man didn't read the comments. He sat by his window watching the city lights flicker, thinking quietly to himself. Sometimes change didn't start with protests or speeches. Sometimes it started with a single moment of truth, one that forced people to see the world a little differently. And that moment had just begun to ripple far beyond that quiet suburban street. The next morning came with noise, and too much noise. News vans parked outside the police station. Reporters stood holding microphones and flashes from cameras lit up the front steps every few seconds. The story had spread far beyond the small town now. It was everywhere and on television, on social media, and coffee shop conversations. People had opinions, strong ones, and everyone wanted answers. Inside the station, the mood was tense. The officers moved quietly through the halls, avoiding eye contact, pretending to stay focused on paperwork. But the whispers were constant. Some felt angry that their department's name was all over the news. Others felt embarrassed. Everyone knew something big was coming. In the middle of it all, the captain sat behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm, but his eyes told a different story. Tired, frustrated, and disappointed. "Yes, we're cooperating," he said. "The Bureau's internal team will arrive by noon. We'll give them everything they need." He hung up and stared at the stack of reports in front of him. Every line reminded him of what had gone wrong. Assumptions, pride, and poor judgment. He rubbed his forehead and sighed deeply. For years he had worked to keep his department clean, to earn trust from the community, and now all that work was falling apart because of one morning, one decision, one stop gone wrong. Outside the station, people had begun gathering with signs, one not angry or violent, just quietly disappointed. Some carried posters that said justice means fairness and no more assumptions. A few news reporters walked through the crowd asking questions, recording reactions. Meanwhile, across town, the man who had been stopped, the FBI agent, sat in a quiet conference room. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched on the table beside him. His badge and folder lay in front of him, neat and organized as always. Across from him sat two people from the Bureau's communications team, preparing him for a statement. "You don't have to go on camera," one of them said gently. "We can issue a written statement instead. But if you want to speak directly, it might help calm things down." He looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said. The team members exchanged looks. "You're sure?" "Yes," he replied softly. "But I'm not doing it to embarrass anyone. I just want to tell the truth." People deserve that. They nodded in agreement. Later that afternoon, a small press conference was held outside the federal building. A crowd gathered. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. The air buzzed with tension, everyone waiting to hear what he would say. When he stepped up to the podium wearing the same calm expression he always had, the crowd went silent. He took a slow breath before speaking. "Yesterday morning," he began, "I was stopped by local officers while waiting in a residential neighborhood. They did not know who I was, and they made assumptions based on what they saw." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. It could have gone worse. "But it didn't, because I chose to stay calm, and eventually the truth came out." Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he continued. "I know the job isn't easy. I've worked alongside police officers for years. But we all have to remember, our duty is to serve without bias, to protect without prejudice. I hope this becomes a lesson for all of us." The speech was short, barely 3 minutes, but it struck a chord. It spread fast across television channels and online platforms. People shared the clip again and again, calling his words powerful, graceful, and needed. That night, the world saw him not just as an agent, but as a man who carried dignity in the face of injustice. At the same time, back in the local police department, the two officers involved watched the clip on a small screen in the break room. The room was quiet except for the sound of his voice coming from the speaker. Neither of them spoke. When the video ended, one of them leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "He didn't even mention us by name," the younger officer said quietly. "He didn't have to," the other replied. "Everyone already knows." They sat there in silence again, both lost in thought. For the first time, they weren't defensive. They weren't angry. They just felt small. The younger one finally said, "He handled it better than we did. I thought he'd lash out, go public, make a scene. But he didn't." The older one nodded slowly. "That's what makes it worse. He didn't need anger to make us look bad. He just needed the truth." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. The captain stepped in, holding a file. His voice was softer this time. "You two need to come with me," he said. They followed him down the hall to a conference room. Inside sat two representatives from the FBI and one from the city council. The atmosphere was serious but calm. One of the FBI representatives spoke first. "We're not here to press charges or make an example out of anyone," she said. "But there has to be accountability." The officers nodded silently. The other representative leaned forward. "We've reviewed the footage and the comments made during the stop. There's clear evidence of unprofessional conduct. The Bureau has recommended that your department implement mandatory training on bias awareness and procedural respect." The captain added quietly, "You'll also be suspended without pay for 3 weeks. After that, you'll attend the training program before returning to duty." The younger officer swallowed hard. "We understand," he said. The room stayed silent for a few seconds. Then the FBI representative added, "The agent you stopped asked us not to pursue any personal action. He said he believes education is more valuable than punishment." That sentence hit harder than any disciplinary notice. They both nodded again, quietly ashamed. The next few days brought a strange kind of calm. The news cycle kept turning, but the anger began to fade. People started talking less about blame and more about lessons. The story became a discussion point in police academies, college classrooms, and community meetings. Even officers from other departments reached out, saying the story had made them think twice about how they approached people. Meanwhile, the agent went back to work quietly as if nothing had happened, but something inside him had changed. He noticed things differently now. The way people looked at him in public, the way other officers hesitated before making judgments. He didn't hold grudges, but he carried a quiet hope that this experience might open a few eyes. One afternoon, while reviewing files in his office, he received a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "I wanted to say thank you. I was one of the officers who stopped you that day. I know saying sorry doesn't fix what happened, but I've been thinking a lot about it. You handled yourself with more patience than we deserved. I'll remember that for the rest of my career." There was no signature, just those words. He read it twice, then placed it gently inside his desk drawer. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. A week later, the local police department held a community meeting. The room was packed, residents, reporters, and officers sitting side by side. The air was heavy with curiosity and tension. The captain stepped up first, speaking briefly about accountability, fairness, and change. Then, to everyone's surprise, he invited the FBI agent to the stage. The room went quiet as the man walked up. He looked around, his eyes scanning the faces, some nervous, some supportive, some simply curious. "I wasn't planning to be here," he began softly. "But I think this conversation matters." He spoke about trust, about understanding, about how fear and judgment can cloud even good intentions. He didn't use complicated words, and he didn't try to sound perfect. He just spoke like one human being to another. When he finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap. Slowly, more people joined in until the entire hall echoed with applause. The officers who had stopped him were sitting in the back, listening quietly. One of them looked down, then slowly clapped too. After the meeting, the agent was about to leave when the two officers approached him. For a moment, none of them said anything. Then the older officer spoke. "We wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything." The agent nodded. "Just do better next time," he said simply. The younger one replied softly, "We will." They shook hands, a small gesture, but a meaningful one. That night, the story aired again on national news. But this time the headline was different. It didn't talk about anger or mistakes. It talked about growth. The segment showed footage from the community meeting, people clapping and the agent's calm voice saying, "Respect has to come before judgment." Viewers across the country shared it, calling it a rare moment of grace in a world too full of conflict. The next morning, the agent went back to his work quietly. No cameras, no reporters, just another day on duty. But everywhere he went, people seemed to recognize him. Not as a victim, but as someone who had shown the best of what patience and dignity could look like. He didn't need fame. He didn't need praise. All he wanted was for people to remember that one simple truth, that humanity should always come before suspicion. And somehow, in a small but powerful way, that message had begun to take root. The video from the officer's body camera spread quickly through the department. Within a few hours, it had reached the desks of several higher officials. No one could believe what they were watching. The footage showed everything clearly: the unnecessary aggression, the false assumptions, and the moment the FBI badge hit the ground. The room went silent as the chief replayed that part again and again, unable to ignore the truth. What began as a simple traffic stop had now turned into a public relations disaster. The officers involved were called in immediately for questioning. Their faces were pale when they entered the chief's office. He didn't shout at them. He didn't need to. The disappointment in his eyes said enough. He asked each of them to explain their side of the story, but their excuses sounded weaker with every word. "We thought he looked suspicious," one of them muttered. The chief leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Suspicious? Or did you just not like what you saw?" No one answered. Meanwhile, the FBI agent stayed silent about the incident. He didn't rush to make a complaint or talk to the media. He simply followed the proper process. His report was detailed and calm, with no anger in his words, only facts. He had faced prejudice before, and this wasn't new to him. But this time he felt something different. A quiet determination to make sure it didn't happen again, not to him or anyone else. At the same time, people in the community began to talk. Someone had leaked part of the footage online, and within hours it was everywhere. Comments poured in. Some people were shocked, others furious. Many couldn't believe that even a man in a suit, polite and respectful, could be treated like a criminal just because of assumptions. It sparked a big conversation, one that spread beyond the small town and reached major news outlets. Reporters camped outside the police station. The chief refused to speak at first, hoping to manage things quietly, but soon the pressure was too much. At a press conference, he admitted there had been a serious mistake. He promised a full investigation. His voice trembled slightly when he said, "We have to do better." It wasn't just words. He knew his department's reputation was now on the line. Behind the scenes, federal officials contacted the local police to discuss what had happened. There was tension at first, but the FBI agent kept his tone professional. He wasn't there for revenge. He simply wanted accountability and change. In private meetings, he spoke softly but firmly, explaining how dangerous that moment had been, not only for him but for everyone involved. "If I had reacted differently even for a second," he said, "someone could have gotten hurt. We can't afford that kind of fear or bias in our work." Those words hit hard. The room stayed silent after he spoke. Some of the officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing just how close they had come to making a tragic mistake. In the following days, the investigation revealed even more details. The officer's own body camera had recorded everything, including a few inappropriate comments made before the stop. They couldn't deny it now. The truth was out. The department announced that the officers involved would be suspended while the case was reviewed. For some, it felt like justice. For others, it was only the beginning of a much larger problem that needed fixing. The agent went back to his work quietly. His team admired the way he handled everything. He never lost his composure, even when the situation could have easily made him angry or bitter. He carried on with his cases, focusing on his duty. But deep down, he knew this story had already become bigger than him. It had started a movement in the town, one that made people start asking harder questions. At community meetings, residents demanded change. They wanted transparency, fairness, and better training for their police officers. A few of the officers who weren't involved in the incident also began speaking up, saying they wanted to rebuild trust with the people they served. For the first time in a long while, there was honest discussion instead of silence. The chief called for new programs, workshops, open forums, and lessons about bias and communication. He reached out to the FBI agent personally and asked if he would be willing to speak at one of the sessions. The agent agreed, not out of pride, but because he believed education was the only real solution. When he stood in front of the room filled with uniformed officers, his voice was calm and steady. "Respect," he said, "is not optional in this job. It's the foundation of everything we do." He didn't scold them or humiliate anyone. Instead, he shared what it felt like to be on the other side, to be treated unfairly despite doing everything right. His honesty left a deep impression. Some officers looked down, others nodded slowly. A few even came up to him afterward to apologize personally. Outside the department, life slowly began to settle, but the memory of that day didn't fade easily. News outlets continued covering the story for weeks. Commentators debated whether real change would come, or if it would all be forgotten once the headlines moved on. But something in that town truly did start to shift. People paid more attention to how officers treated others. Some locals volunteered to help create community programs that encouraged better understanding between law enforcement and citizens. Even though the agent never asked for attention, his story became an example shared in training programs across the country, not as a tale of conflict but as a reminder that judgment without understanding can destroy trust in seconds. The FBI quietly commended him for his professionalism, noting that his actions likely prevented a dangerous situation from turning worse. The officers involved faced internal discipline, but the agent didn't celebrate their punishment. Instead, he hoped they learned something valuable, something that would change how they saw people in the future. He believed in redemption, not revenge. When asked later how he managed to stay so calm, he simply said, "Anger doesn't fix what ignorance breaks. Only awareness does." Weeks later, the department issued an official apology. The chief made sure it wasn't just words on paper. He met with the agent privately, shaking his hand firmly. "You had every right to be furious," he said, "but instead you chose to help us get better. That means something." The agent nodded with a faint smile, replying, "That's all I ever wanted." The apology was broadcast publicly, and though some were still skeptical, many appreciated the accountability. It was rare for such incidents to end with honesty and growth instead of hostility. Slowly, the tension in the community eased. The following month, the agent returned to his undercover work. The operation he had been conducting resumed, but he carried with him a deeper sense of purpose. He now understood that his role wasn't only about enforcing the law, it was also about changing minds one action at a time. On a quiet evening, he sat in his car near the same neighborhood where it all happened. The same streetlights glowed softly. The air felt still, almost peaceful. He thought about how fast life could change, how one misunderstanding could turn into a national story, and how even pain could lead to progress. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and resolve. In the distance, 2 patrol cars passed slowly. This time, the officers waved as they recognized him. He nodded back. There was no anger left, only mutual respect. That simple gesture, he thought, was a small sign that things were finally starting to change. When he drove away, the night felt lighter, like a heavy chapter was coming to an end. He knew there was still a long way to go. Prejudice doesn't disappear overnight. But he also knew that awareness had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, it started that day when a few officers learned the hard way that judgment based on color could blind them to the truth standing right in front of them. The story didn't end in anger or revenge. It ended in understanding. And sometimes that's the strongest kind of justice there is.